My mom testified against me in court to make me pay child support for a baby that isn't mine because, saying, the dad doesn't matter, family is family. Months later, I exposed my wife, and now my mom is crying because the entire family disowned her. I, 32, never thought my life would implode the way it is over the past year and a half. What started as discovering my wife's affair spiraled into a nightmare involving child support for a baby that wasn't mine, my own mother testifying against me in court, and family secrets that have torn everyone apart. My ex-wife and I were married for 6 years. The marriage wasn't perfect, but it was solid enough. We both wanted kids eventually, but agreed to wait until we were more financially stable. I work as a restaurant manager with decent pay, but brutal hours. 60-hour weeks, holidays spent serving others instead of celebrating with family, and the constant stress of keeping both customers and staff happy had taken a toll on me. Still, I was proud of the life we'd built together in our modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. About 18 months ago, I noticed changes in my wife's behavior, secretive with her phone, working late more often, and our intimacy had disappeared. She started paying more attention to her appearance too, new clothes, different hairstyle, spending hours getting ready before heading to work. I tried talking to her about it, but she always dismissed my concerns as work stress. You're being paranoid, she'd say, rolling her eyes while clutching her phone like it contained state secrets. Not everything is about you. Then came the day I'll never forget. I came home early from work because of a pipe burst at the restaurant, and there she was with her coworker in our bed. Our bed. The one I'd saved for months to buy when we first moved in together. I stood in the doorway, frozen, as they scrambled to cover themselves. Her face went from shock to shame in an instant. The guy, I recognized him from her office Christmas party, couldn't even look me in the eyes. I didn't make a scene, just turned around, walked out, and drove to my friend's place. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. The betrayal felt physical, like someone had hollowed out my chest with a rusty spoon. She blew up my phone with texts and calls, begging me to come back to talk. When I returned the next day, she was crying, claiming it was a mistake that had only happened once. We can fix this, she pleaded, her makeup streaked down her face. People make mistakes. Don't throw away 6 years over one stupid night. I asked to see her phone, and after hesitating, she handed it over. I found hundreds of messages between her and this guy going back months. They weren't just having an affair. They were making plans for a future together. When are you going to leave him? He'd written. Soon, she'd replied. Just waiting for the right time. They'd even looked at apartments together. In one message, she complained about how I was always working and emotionally unavailable. The irony was suffocating. I moved out that day and filed for divorce within the week. I couldn't bear to sleep in that bedroom again, knowing what had happened there. The divorce was straightforward since we didn't have kids or many joint assets and was finalized 3 months later. I thought that would be the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. About 2 months after our divorce, my ex contacted me saying she was pregnant and that I was the father. I was shocked because we hadn't been intimate for months before our separation. The timing made absolutely no sense. We hadn't shared a bed for at least 4 months before I caught her cheating. When I pointed this out, she claimed it must have been that one time right before everything fell apart. Remember that night after your birthday dinner? We both had wine. She suggested, inventing a reconciliation that never happened. I knew this wasn't true. I told her I wanted a paternity test. She got angry, saying I was abandoning my responsibilities and needed to man up and support her and the baby. You're really going to turn your back on your own child? She screamed over the phone. What kind of monster does that? I refused, and she threatened to take me to court. Her voice turned cold. Fine. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. And everyone will know what a deadbeat you are. True to her word, I was served with paternity and child support papers a few weeks later. I hired an attorney immediately who assured me that with a paternity test, this would be easily resolved. What I didn't expect was my own mother's reaction. Instead of supporting me, she was furious that I was abandoning my child. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, her face flushed with anger. How could you? She demanded, pushing past me into the living room. Your own flesh and blood. No matter how many times I explained the timeline didn't add up and that my ex had been cheating, my mother wouldn't listen. She kept saying family is family and that I needed to step up. Sometimes being a man means doing the right thing even when it's hard, she insisted, her voice dripping with disappointment. I couldn't understand why she was taking my ex's side so adamantly. On the day of the first court hearing, I was confident the judge would order a paternity test. My attorney had prepared thoroughly, laying out the timeline that made it biologically impossible for the child to be mine. As I sat in the courtroom, adjusting my tie nervously and trying to ignore the icy glares from my ex across the aisle, I noticed my mother walk in. She was dressed formally, like she was going to church, her favorite pearl necklace gleaming against her navy blue dress. I assumed she had come to support me despite our disagreement. Couldn't have been more wrong. When our case was called, my ex-wife's attorney called my mother as a witness. I was completely blindsided. My mother took the stand and testified that I had admitted to her that I was the father, but was trying to get out of my responsibilities. The blood drained from my face as I watched her place her hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth, only to lie through her teeth about her own son. She claimed I had a history of running away from problems and was just trying to avoid paying child support. He told me he doesn't want to be tied down with child support payments, she said confidently. He said he'd rather deny the baby than pay for it. None of this was true. I had consistently maintained that the baby couldn't be mine. My attorney objected multiple times, but the damage was done. The judge looked at me with disappointment. Thankfully, despite my mother's testimony, the judge still ordered a paternity test. My ex looked smug as we left the courtroom, whispering something to my mother who nodded sympathetically. I left the courthouse in shock, unable to even look at my mother as she tried to approach me. I did what I had to do, she called after me as I walked to my car. "You'll thank me someday when you've come to your senses." My father, who couldn't attend the hearing due to work, was livid when I told him what happened. He couldn't believe my mother would lie under oath against her own son. That night, he called to say they'd had the biggest fight of their 35-year marriage. "I've never seen this side of her," he said, his voice hoarse from yelling. "I don't even know who she is anymore." The paternity test results came back 2 weeks later, confirming what I knew all along: I was not the father. I remember staring at the paper, the clinical language stating with 99.9% certainty that I had no biological connection to the unborn child. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by renewed anger at my mother's betrayal. The case was dismissed, but the damage to my family was already done. My mother refused to apologize. Instead, she doubled down saying biology doesn't make a family and that I should have stepped up regardless. She actually had the audacity to claim that since I had been married to my ex when the baby was conceived, which wasn't even true, I had a moral obligation to support the child. "Your father would have done the right thing," she insisted, a comment that made no sense to me at the time. Meanwhile, my ex had moved in with her coworker, the actual father of her child. I drove past their apartment once, a sleek downtown complex that made our modest home look shabby in comparison. I wondered if she'd been planning this upgrade all along. Yet, she was still bitter about losing the case and began spreading rumors in our social circle that I had abandoned her when she got pregnant. Former friends would cross the street to avoid me. I received nasty messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. One couple we used to have dinner with monthly sent me a long email about how disappointed they were in me for abandoning my family. At this point, I was emotionally exhausted and just wanted to move on. I started seeing a therapist and focused on my job and rebuilding my life. But the situation with my mother continued to eat at me. Then came the next bombshell. About 6 months after the court case, I was having dinner with my father when he confided something that made everything suddenly make sense. My mother had had an affair early in their marriage, and my older sister, 36, who I always believed was my full sister, was actually the product of that affair. My father had chosen to raise her as his own despite knowing the truth. I nearly choked on my beer as he told me, his eyes fixed on the table between us. "I found out when she was 2, he said quietly. "Blood type didn't match. Your mother confessed everything." This revelation hit me hard. My mother had projected her own past onto my situation. She expected me to do what my father had done, raise another man's child without question. Every time she'd said family is family or biology doesn't matter, she'd been speaking from her own guilt and experience. The difference was my father had made that choice himself. He hadn't been tricked or coerced, he decided with full knowledge to be a father to my sister. My mother was trying to force me into it through lies and manipulation. I remembered all the times growing up when she'd praised my father for being such a good man and how she'd emphasized that real men take responsibility. It had all been about her secret, her guilt. I decided to confront my mother. I couldn't let this hypocrisy stand any longer. I invited both parents to my apartment, cleaning frantically beforehand as if a spotless home could somehow make this conversation less painful. When they arrived, my mother immediately launched into her usual lecture about family responsibility. I let her talk for a minute, watching my father's face grow increasingly uncomfortable. Then, before she could start her usual guilt trip, I laid out everything I knew. I told her I understood why she did what she did in court, but that it didn't make it right. I explained how her lies had nearly cost me years of financial support for a child that wasn't mine, all because she wanted to rewrite her own history. My mother went pale. She looked at my father who nodded, confirming he had told me. She burst into tears, not of remorse, but of anger. Her face contorted with rage as she realized her secret was out. She accused my father of betraying her by sharing private family business and stormed out. The door slammed so hard that a framed photo fell off the wall and shattered on the floor. Ironically, it was a family portrait from my sister's college graduation. That night, my sister called me hysterical. Apparently, my mother had gone straight to her house and told her everything about her biological father. My sister had never known the truth. She was devastated not by the revelation itself, but by finding out this way as a weapon in my mother's arsenal rather than as a thoughtful conversation. She just blurted it out. My sister sobbed over the phone. She said, "Your brother knows you're not a real part of this family, so I might as well tell you too." Who says that to their child? I spent hours on the phone with her that night, both of us trying to process the wreckage of what our family had become. Why I hadn't mentioned earlier is that while gathering evidence for my case, I've discovered emails between my ex-wife and my mother dating back to before our divorce was finalized. My attorney had subpoenaed my ex's email records as part of our defense, and there they were, dozens of exchanges with my mother's email address. They had been in contact the entire time, planning how to handle the pregnancy situation. "He'll cave if we push hard enough," my mother had written. Men always do. My mother had been advising my ex on how to approach me, what to say to make me feel guilty, and even suggested specific language for legal filings. "Emphasize how he's abandoning his child, that always works on judges," she'd advised. This discovery made my blood boil. Not only had my mother lied under oath, but she had been actively conspiring with my ex against me for months. The betrayal was so deep it felt like quicksand, The more I struggled to understand it, the further I sank into disbelief. When I confronted her with these emails, printed out and arranged chronologically in a binder that I dropped on her kitchen table, she claimed she was just trying to be supportive of my ex during a difficult time. She needed someone, my mother said defensively. You were being so cold to her. The casual way she dismissed her conspiracy was almost more infuriating than the betrayal itself. Over the next few weeks, our extended family began to learn about everything. My mother's testimony, her conspiracy with my ex, and the revelation about my sister. The fallout was massive. My Aunt Martha, my mother's own sister, called me in tears to apologize for having doubted me. I should have known something was off, she said. Your mother was too invested, too angry about it all. Aunts, uncles, cousins. Nearly everyone took my side, appalled by what my mother had done. My mother found herself increasingly isolated as family members distanced themselves from her. Holiday plans changed. Invitations withdrawn. Phone calls unanswered. The family matriarch who had always hosted Thanksgiving found herself uninvited to her own brother's Christmas dinner. My father, who had stood by her for decades to spy her affair, finally reached his breaking point. He called to say he was considering divorce, that watching her try to force me to pay for another man's child while lying under oath was something he couldn't forgive. I forgave her once, he told me, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. I won't make that mistake again. Throughout all this, my ex continued trying to paint me as the villain. She had given birth by this point and occasionally sent me pictures of the baby with captions like, "Look at the daughter you refuse to claim, or she has your eyes," which was both manipulative and biologically impossible. The baby had her biological father's distinctive cleft chin and auburn hair, nothing like my dark complexion and features. I finally had enough. The constant manipulation, the lies, the damage to my reputation, it was time to put an end to it all. I compiled all the evidence of her affair, text messages, emails, even security footage from our home showing her bringing her coworker over when I was at work. I hadn't mentioned the security cameras before, but we'd installed them after a break-in down the street. They'd captured her coworker entering our home on 17 different occasions when I was working late shifts. I shared it all in a detailed post on social media, tagging mutual friends and family who had been taken in by her lies. I included screenshots of the paternity test results and court documents showing my mother's false testimony. I explained everything, how my ex tried to trap me into paying child support for her fair partner's baby, how my own mother lied under oath to support this scheme, and how I had been vilified simply for wanting the truth. The post was over 2,000 words long, meticulously documented with dates, times, and evidence. I'd spent an entire weekend putting it together, making sure every claim was backed up by proof. My hands shook as I hit post, knowing I was about to change many relationships permanently, but I couldn't live with the lies anymore. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started buzzing with notifications within minutes. People who had believed my ex's version reached out to apologize. I had no idea, wrote a college friend. "Man, I'm so sorry I judged you." Friends I thought I'd lost reconnected with me. My ex's social media went private within hours, and I heard through mutual friends that she and her partner had a huge fight when he saw just how calculated her attempts to pin the baby on me had been. Apparently, he hadn't known the full extent of her scheming and was horrified to learn she'd tried to pass their child off as mine. As for my mother, the public exposure of her actions was the final nail in the coffin of her reputation. Neighbors who had known us for decades crossed the street to avoid her. Her bridge club uninvited her. The church group she'd led for 15 years asked her to step down. My father moved out the following week and is staying with my uncle while figuring out next steps. He called me late one night, sounding more relaxed than I'd heard him in years. "I should have done this a long time ago," he said. "I wasted decades trying to make things work with someone who never respected me." He told me he's speaking with a divorce attorney and plans to file soon. The court case itself took more twists than I initially shared. After the first paternity test came back negative, my ex's attorney tried to argue that the test could be wrong and requested a second. The court case itself took more twists than I initially shared. After the first paternity test came back negative, my ex's attorney tried to argue that the test could be wrong and requested a second one from a different lab. The judge looked skeptical but agreed to be thorough. My ex smirked at me across the courtroom, as if she knew something I didn't. I spent another anxious 2 weeks waiting for results. The second test, of course, confirmed the first. I was not the father. But my ex wasn't done. She then tried to argue that under the state's presumed father laws, I could still be held responsible since we were married when the baby was conceived. Her attorney cited cases where non-biological fathers had been ordered to pay child support due to this legal presumption. The judge leaned forward, frowning, as they made this argument. My stomach dropped. Could I really be forced to pay despite the DNA evidence? Thankfully, my attorney was prepared for this argument. She was worth every penny of her $350 hourly rate. She presented evidence showing we had been separated at the time of conception, including rental agreements for my temporary housing and testimonies from neighbors who confirmed I hadn't been living in our marital home. "Your Honor," she said confidently, "the precedents cited by opposing counsel all involve men who were living with their wives as a family unit at the time of conception. That simply wasn't the case here." She then produced records showing my ex had already listed her coworker as the father on prenatal medical forms. The judge finally dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning my ex couldn't bring it back to court. He also ordered her to pay my legal fees, citing the frivolous and vexatious nature of her claims given the clear timeline and 2 negative paternity tests. This was a significant relief as the legal battle had already cost me over $15,000. I'd had to withdraw from my 401k to cover the expenses, setting my retirement plans back years. My sister, upon learning she was the product of our mother's affair, decided to search for her biological father. Using a DNA testing service and some old photos and letters she found in our mother's belongings, she identified him, a man who had been my mother's coworker at her first job. He still lived in the same state, just a few hours away. She contacted him cautiously, unsure what to expect. For weeks, she agonized over what to say, drafting and redrafting her message. What if he doesn't want anything to do with me? She worried. What if this ruins his life too? His response was emotional. He had suspected she might be his daughter, but had respected my mother's decision to stay with her husband. He had never married or had other children. The email he sent back began simply, "I have thought about you every day for 36 years. They arranged to meet, and I went with her for support. We drove 3 hours to a quiet cafe in his hometown, my sister changing her outfit twice before we left. Meeting this man was surreal. He stood as we entered, a tall man with my sister's eyes and smile. He looked so much like my sister that it was undeniable. They shared the same smile, the same laugh, even similar mannerisms. The way they both talked with their hands, the identical head tilt when they were thinking. I felt like I was watching my sister interact with a male version of herself. He expressed regret about the affair, but joy at finally meeting his daughter. Over lunch that stretched into dinner, they discovered shared interests. They even had the same obscure taste in 70s folk music. He also made it clear he didn't want to disrupt our lives or replace our father who had raised her with love her entire life. I would never try to take that away from him, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'd be honored to know you, if you want that too. My mother was livid when she learned about this meeting. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, yelling about how we were betraying the family by connecting with that man. After everything I've done for this family. She screamed, pacing my living room like a caged animal. This is how you repay me? I remained calm, pointing out the hypocrisy of her being angry about this while having expected me to raise another man's child without question. My father, despite the pain of revisiting this old wound, expressed support for my sister's decision to meet her biological father. They had several long conversations where my father reassured her that nothing had changed between them. You're my daughter, he told her firmly. Biology be damned. I changed your diapers, taught you to ride a bike, and walked you down the aisle. Nothing will ever change that, he said, knowing the truth and having questions answered was her right. His grace through this process only highlighted how petty and selfish my mother's behavior had been. As for my ex-wife, I heard through mutual friends that her new life isn't the fairy tale she expected. Her partner isn't thrilled about parenthood. He misses important appointments and is generally unreliable. Apparently, he was fine with the affair but hadn't bargained on sudden fatherhood. He works late most nights, leaving her alone with the baby. My ex, desperate and struggling, actually reached out again, suggesting we could work things out for the sake of our family. I've been thinking about us, she texted one night. Maybe we were too hasty ending things. The baby needs a father figure. I forwarded the message to my attorney who sent a cease and desist letter. The irony, she threw away our marriage for this guy. Tried to force me to pay for their child, and now that he's disappointing her, she wants to come back to the security I once provided. I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered the months of lies, manipulation, and how close she came to trapping me in a lifetime of financial obligation for another man's child. Karma works in mysterious ways. My sister and I have become closer through all this. We used to be typical siblings, birthday calls, occasional dinners, but nothing deep. Now we talk almost daily. We've been supporting each other through family therapy sessions, which has been healing for both of us. I never realized how much Mom manipulated all of us, she said during one session. It's like we're finally seeing clearly for the first time. She's developed a relationship with her biological father with clear boundaries that respect my dad's role in her life. They meet monthly for coffee, slowly building a friendship that honors the past while looking toward the future. My mother remains isolated, still unwilling to acknowledge what she did. She occasionally sends messages saying she misses her family and doesn't understand why everyone is being so harsh with her. All I ever did was try to keep this family together, she wrote in her last email. Her inability to take responsibility continues to be the barrier to any reconciliation. I've told her clearly that until she can honestly admit what she did and why it was wrong, I can't have her in my life. The ball is in her court. I've somehow managed to keep my job and even received a promotion to general manager. The owner noticed how I maintained my professionalism despite the personal chaos, never missing a shift or bringing my problems to work. If you can handle all that and still run a tight kitchen, he said, you can handle anything. I started dating again, cautiously. My current girlfriend knows the whole story and has been incredibly supportive. She's a kindergarten teacher with a calming presence that balances my tendency to overthink. We're taking things slowly, but for the first time since my divorce, I'm thinking about the future with hope instead of dread. It's been a hell of a journey. I've lost my marriage and my relationship with my mother, but I've gained clarity, strength, and deeper connections with the family members who stood by me. I'm still working with my therapist, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on solid ground. I don't know what the future holds, but I know standing up for the truth was the right thing to do. And I won't apologize for that to my mother, my ex, or anyone else.